So, more about education as a tool to systems of power. Growing up, I felt free to ask my mom any questions that I had about sex, and she always answered them. The only issue was the limitations to her own knowledge. And those were created not only in her own experiences with sexuality, but what she was taught herself in sex ed, which wasn't a lot, and that hasn't changed much since she was, in schools. Um, and so then when there's the big debate about whether or not education about sex should be left up to parents or the education system, in a sense, they're still just being taught by the education system since that happens to be where parents gain their knowledge. If anything, it'll become more restricted based on people's own views regarding sexuality. So, when faced with this education reform regarding sex, I think it's important to become more radical because it is a part of an overarching system of oppression, specifically of patriarchy. And so a more radical approach is needed in reforming the system itself. And we talked a lot about that today, starting it from practice rather than difference, and also expanding sexuality so it's ingrained in other topics as well, such as history, I think would be a great approach. Personally, I wonder if the system had been radicalized to include more queer sexualities, if I would have discovered or developed my pansexuality earlier. I wonder how it would help people, such as myself, because since being gay is so stigmatized, I think it's easier for people to identify with gay because the even though it's being talked about kind of badly in the American sense or in a tolerated sense in Amsterdam, it's still being talked about because discourse becomes society and society produces discourse. So even talking about it poorly, we'd still be talking about it and putting those words into a sphere in which individuals who need them can access them. So I think that's important. Something that I noticed in both Nadja and Yvette's presentations about people with a non Western immigrant background and sex workers is that the policies affecting them that are meant to help them are actually quite counterproductive. So for Nadja, that was about the kind of education of these people with immigrant backgrounds. They were forced into Arabic classes when a lot of them didn't know Arabic and had no use for it with their family. The kind of assumptions that were made about their background and assuming that there were certain kind of jobs that they wanted, different things like that. And with Nadja, the whole licensing issue and recent legal actions that were taken that were meant to ensure the safety and help victims of human trafficking, while really it just hindered sex workers' businesses because even though they were consensually doing something, it wasn't seen so by the law based on certain erroneous things, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that when making these laws, representatives from these groups weren't necessarily talked with. Nadja talked to how maybe they talked to one person or some kind of corporation meant to represent these people, but with people of immigrant background, they came from all these different places in Morocco. And so None of them even spoke the same language a lot of times, these people with immigrant backgrounds or the immigrants themselves. And so it's very hard to say that this very diverse group can be seen as like a single person. And then with sex workers, it's counterproductive to be putting such regulations on sex workers when it doesn't actually combat those who are forced into human trafficking. Human trafficking is terrible and really needs to be stopped, but it's not going to be stopped by looking at those who go to get licenses or those who don't have 6 clean towels in their workroom. Like Parliament and other governments, like the Dutch government, would know that if they actually just consulted sex workers and asked, like, what do you need from us? That same thing would be happening with people of immigrant backgrounds. And that reminds me a lot of the fight over abortion in the United States. You know, they're like, oh, if we just like outlaw abortions, they won't happen. But that's not looking at the bigger issue of people who are just too poor to raise a child. Like, how are you going to fix poverty? Sex education, so people understand the consequences of sex. One of the consequences of sex. Also, access to birth control. How these issues are highly racialized, classist, and sexist across all fronts is just not being looked at. And you have to consider that that isn't being looked at because these systems of power have people in them who are benefiting from these systems of power. So, of course, they wouldn't want to change them. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. So today in class we had a very scintillating conversation. Happy birthday to me. But having taken History 420 at MSU, not all the information that we were given was necessarily news to me. I asked a question about the shift from the one-sex body to the two-sex body that's talked about in Thomas LaCour's Making Sex. And she answered that it had to do with the medicalization of things, which is a product of colonization. And that happened possibly in, say, the 1500s. And I was thinking about how all these references to how gendering flesh has come to happen is a lot of times looked at in the Western sense. You know, they talked about how the change from feudal Europe was the creation of like sexism. The medicalization in Europe is what brought forth gendering the flesh. But if you look at other histories of places, there's a different timeline for the gendering of flesh and how it came to be. For instance, I did a research project on gender and sexuality in Heian era Japan, which is, I think, 842 to the mid 1100s. And at the end of that era, they were already gendering flesh there, believing in the two-sex model. Although chalking it up to the two-sex model is a generalization. It was much more complex than that. But I just think it's interesting that when gender and sexuality are explored, it's focused on European civilization, and any look into the East or Asia or Africa is a token representation. And I think that speaks a lot to the colonization that we were talking about, that takes control and creates a hierarchy of what's good, what's bad, what's real, what's not. And then also there was a point when we were talking about the medicalization being an issue in trans communities because it makes you think that there's a cure or a point A to point B that you need to get to in order to be cured, to be whole, to be valid, and how that trans people's words aren't taken as true because they aren't deemed as real because they aren't a man or a woman, they are a trans person, and that trans means a lot because in medical dictionaries it's oftentimes described as a pathology, and so it's treated much like a mental illness in that sense. But it just hearing her story and about how she was in a PhD program and the professor that was mentoring her didn't treat her very well, and the advisor council didn't do anything about it until someone else said that she was being treated like crap. Reminds me a lot of my own path with mental illness and how, I'd reach out for help or I'd be like, oh, I don't think this medicine is really helping me. And they'd be like, no, you don't mean that. It's only after, my friends or my family speaks up that they really take into consideration what I've been saying. And I don't even know if they take into consideration what I'm saying or what somebody else is saying about me. So in that sense, I can very much relate to the problem of medicalization, though I don't think medicine is necessarily bad because it can be helpful in certain ways. Like, it's great that I didn't die from polio, but I do think we need to re-examine the structures holding it up and the power that's at play there. And I think that's really what she was trying to get us to think about, is how we can change these systems for the better. I think the biggest takeaway this week is how cyclical all issues are and how interlocked each issue is. You can't separate a race issue from a class issue, from a gender issue, from sexuality. It all mangles together to create the prism of oppression, and they are all created by kind of the same power structures, which we have talked about before. But I think in hearing issues about sex workers, about trans people, and about people with non-Western immigrant backgrounds here in Dutch society, it really played into that. And the cyclicalness comes from the fact that, we're produced from these power structures, but then all our actions feed into and reinforce these power structures. And so I just wonder, if it's cyclical, does it matter where we take action from? Do we need to take action at both the societal level and at the systematic level at the same time? Is there a better place to start? I don't know. I do not know. But hopefully next week, since we are continuing certain lectures, it'll become more clear and also give ideas as to how to infiltrate these kinds of systems of power and how to destroy them, whether it be from society up or system down. That was my week.
Oh my god, he said it twice and I was like,
I know.
okay?
Interesting.
Oh, damn it.
I just got rid of the picture.
Like, you can't mark this down and then say it in a lecture. Yeah, that kind of confuses me, but